Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about a gangster named Dutch Schultz and his buried treasure in New York. So before we get into the details of the buried treasure, you probably need to understand who Dutch Schultz was. So we'll go through a little bit of information about him and his life. So on August 6th of 1901, a man named Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was born in the Bronx. And this is in New York, part of New York City. So he was born in the Bronx to German Jewish immigrants Hermann and Emma Flegenheimer. By 1910, Hermann had either died or abandoned the family. So by 8th grade, young Arthur had already left school to help support his mother and his little sister. So young Arthur, he started to get involved in crime when he worked at a club that was owned by a small-time mobster. So by the age of 18, Arthur was in prison for burglary. In December of 1920, he was released on parole. He went back to work at the Schultz trucking company that he was working at prior to his arrest. As Prohibition had hit the U.S., the trucking company that he worked for turned to smuggling beer and liquor from Canada into New York City. So this caused Arthur to come into contact and associate with some very well-known criminals of the underworld. At this time, Arthur gained his nickname of Dutch Schultz. Eventually, Dutch had a disagreement with the Schultz trucking company and he left there to go to work for their Italian competition. So by the mid-1920s, Dutch had become a bouncer at a local speakeasy called the Hub Social Club, and it was owned by a gangster named Joey Noe. So Dutch earned a reputation of being a very violent man when he lost his temper, and it didn't go unnoticed by the club owner, who eventually made him a partner in their bootlegging operation. Soon they had many illegal drinking joints in the Bronx. Dutch and Joey had one issue in their area. They had to deal with brothers Joe and John Rock, who already had been running a successful bootlegging operation in the Bronx by this point. So Dutch and Joey, they tried to find a way to muscle into these brothers' bootlegging operation or take over some more territory. And when these brothers refused to buy beer from Dutch and Joey, they eventually figured they needed to find a way to muscle into their operation or outmuscle it. So eventually, one of the brothers, John, he agreed to cooperate, but not the younger brother, Joe. So one night, Dutch and Joey kidnapped Joe and took him to a warehouse and hung him from meat hooks. So what they did at this point, I believe they beat him pretty good, and it was said that they wrapped gauze bandages around his eyes, but these bandages were said to be smeared with gonorrhea discharge infection. So his family did end up paying $35,000 to free him, but he eventually went blind. It was said he went blind shortly after his kidnapping from the infection that spread into his eyes. So after this situation, Dutch and Joey met no resistance or opposition anywhere. Their bootlegging operations made them very rich. So at this point, Dutch and Joey's operations rivaled the Italian mafia's operations. And Dutch and Joey started to expand their operation into Manhattan. And the mob was not too keen on that. So on October 16th of 1928, Joey was shot outside a speakeasy named the Chateau Madrid. He eventually died about a month later due to infections of his wounds. Dutch was angry that he had lost his partner, his best friend, and his mentor. So the getaway car had been found, and it was found that a man that was dead in the back seat of this getaway car belonged to the Jewish mob. So Dutch wasted no time, and on November 6th of 1928, Dutch took out Arnold Rothstein, who was a kingpin in the Jewish mob. So eventually, as Prohibition ended, Dutch's gang got into racketeering and were good at fixing numbers games in their favor and various other gambling operations and things like that that they had going on. So Dutch continued to gain a lot of money, but he also gained a lot of enemies along the way. Dutch also, of course, was not paying taxes and was at the crosshairs of a U.S. attorney named Thomas Dewey, who wanted to make a name for himself at this point. And I believe this same type of tax evasion stuff happened to Al Capone and put him in prison just prior to this, a couple years prior. So this was the early 1930s, and Dutch was pulling much more of his share of the profits to fund his legal defense, a lot more than a lot of his associates and underlings were happy with. And they weren't so happy about this because then they were seeing a little less money coming their way because Dutch was keeping more of the profits to fund his legal defense. So they were getting a little disgruntled at this point too. So Dutch's chief lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, he sought advice about this situation and was put in touch with Charlie Lucky Luciano. Dutch's territory was already in the process of being broken up due to the fact that everyone believed that Dutch was going to be found guilty of tax evasion and he was going to end up in prison again. And somehow Dutch was acquitted. And soon after, his chief lieutenant, Bo Weinberg, was never seen again. Lucky Luciano had told Dutch that they were just looking after his interests while he was away so that Dutch could return once the heat was down. And apparently, Dutch just kind of let that go as fact, even though it seemed they were probably likely planning to take over his empire as they expected Dutch to be imprisoned. So Dutch was really upset with U.S. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. And Dutch proposed to the National Crime Syndicate, which is a loose organization of mobsters that come together to share mob business and everything. Dutch proposed to them that they should all take out Dewey. They should have a plan to take Dewey out. And the syndicate voted against this because they felt it would bring unneeded heat and excessive crackdowns by law enforcement, and they didn't want any part of that. Dutch then vowed to take out Dewey himself. So the syndicate could not have this either. They didn't want this extra heat, and an order was then put out to instead take out Dutch. So eventually Dutch was shot on October 23rd, 1935 at the Palace Chop House in New Jersey, in Newark, New Jersey. It was kind of Dutch's center of operations, and this was a place that he owned and ran a lot of his meetings. Dutch Schultz was in the bathroom when two hitmen entered the restaurant, and they shot Dutch. And in Dutch's company at the Palace Chop House that night was his accountant, Abe Landau. He also had friend Otto Berman there with him and his bodyguard Bernard Lulu Rosencrantz. So the hitmen were Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. The hitmen took return fire from Dutch's gang, but they escaped. Workman was in bad shape and he was left for dead a ways from the restaurant. And ambulances were called from the restaurant and they transported Dutch and his mobster friends to the hospital. So Otto Berman and Abe Landau, they would die shortly after making it to the hospital. And Dutch was taken into surgery. And the next day, Bernard Lulu Rosencrans and also Dutch Schultz would die of their injuries. On the same night Dutch was ambushed, so was Marty Clompier. And that was Dutch's head of his Manhattan operation. But Marty would survive. So at this point, Dutch was estimated to be worth about $7 million at the time of his death. But none of the money was ever found. After his death, a story started to emerge. When Dutch was sure that he was going to be convicted of tax evasion, he commissioned the building of a watertight, airtight safe to be made for him. In it, he placed $7 million worth of cash, Liberty bonds, jewels, gold, and gold coins. Dutch Schultz and bodyguard Bernard Lulu Rosencrans then buried this safe in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. It was said to be buried next to the Esopus Creek near Phoenicia, New York. He planned to have a nest egg once he emerged from prison. At this point, he thought he was going to prison. He thought he'd be in prison for a long time, and he wanted to have money to support himself once he came out of prison. So the safe was said to be packed with all this money and gold and jewels from a hideout that they had near Bridgeport, Connecticut. And in attendance at this hideout when they packed this safe, it was said to be Dutch, Lulu Rosencrans, and Marty Clompier. So Dutch had the only key to the safe. And that night, then Dutch and Lulu took the safe across the Hudson River, and they ended up near Phoenicia, New York, where they buried it next to the creek and carved an X into a tree at that location. Dutch swore Lulu to secrecy about the location, but as you know, there is no honor among thieves. Lulu would go on to tell Marty the location since he was already aware of the safe's existence. Some said that Lulu even drew a map for Marty. Marty would go on to tell his girlfriend about the safe and that he had a map to the location. A little later on, Marty found out that this girlfriend was connected with mobster Jake Shapiro. And it was believed this is what led to Marty being gunned down, as those hitmen that tried to gun him down then took the map that Marty had in his wallet. So Marty was never able to find the treasure without the map. And it was said that Jake Shapiro never found the treasure either. A lot of people believe that word did spread among the mobster community and that the treasure could have been found, but other people state that not a single Liberty bond, which would be worth a fortune now that they're matured, not a single Liberty bond had ever been redeemed. If the treasure was found in the past, people believe that there is no way that at least some of those bonds would not have been cashed in. So, what do you think? Is Dutch Schultz's treasure still out there? What are your thoughts? So I was going to just end the story about Dutch Schultz's lost treasure at what I've already told you, but I've come across another source, some people that have another idea, and I thought I would go ahead and actually share that with you too. So some researchers have looked into things a little bit deeper into Dutch Schultz and his connection to the area near Phoenicia, New York. And they say the reason that Dutch chose to bury his treasure up there is because he was extremely familiar with the area already, because during his bootlegging operations, he had quite a few whiskey stills in the mountains, in the remote mountains near Phoenicia, and he used to stay at the Phoenicia Hotel, and then he would take a car and go up into the hills, and he would check on his moonshine stills, whiskey stills, and stuff like that. So they say this was the reason that he chose this area, but they also said that there was a train that went from New York City all the way up to Phoenicia and past Phoenicia, and that train likely carried Dutch multiple times, many times. So what they speculate was when he had the money or the safe and he was going to bury it, they said he likely did not get off at the train station in Phoenicia. There were also very small stations or stop-off points along the way or even beyond Phoenicia, and they said they believe he likely got off at a little stop called Lanesville, New York, and they believe he got off there because he had some stills in the area, knew the area really well, and they believe that the creek that he buried the treasure beside was actually Stony Clove Creek, somewhere near Lanesville, New York, which is the next town kind of northeast of Phoenicia, New York. And some of that does make sense that, if you had a bunch of money on you and stuff, you're probably not going to get off at a normal main tourist stop with a lot of other people and arouse, attention or anything like that. If you got off the train at a spot where maybe no one else is getting off of the train, just a little stop, which wasn't even hardly a town or anything like that at that point. If you got off there, you may be all by yourself and be able to, take your box or however you were concealing your safe and take it out into the woods or next to the creek. And if you were the only person that got off the train there, no one's going to be watching you. Everyone else just continues on the train and they're gone. So these people did have a really good point there, and they said that the people that are searching along the creek by Phoenicia, New York, there were lots more tourists in that area. That was an area in the Catskill Mountains that a lot of New Yorkers would go up to and get out of the city and relax and everything. So you probably wouldn't be burying your treasure anywhere near where there might be a lot of, New Yorkers and tourists, or maybe even people that might recognize who he was. He probably wasn't doing it right there, but he may have done it close by in the hills where he knew he could have some privacy to bury his treasure and not be seen, and still be in an area he was familiar with because he's had his stills in these areas for many years through all the, the Prohibition years of the 1920s and stuff. So anyhow, that was another source that I ran across that, I guess, I don't know if you want to call it a source or not, but some researchers that had some really good points. So they said, a lot of their team is looking along Stony Clove Creek near Lanesville, New York, rather than right near Phoenicia, New York, and the creek that runs through there. So anyhow, you can let me know of your thoughts on this. I mean, at worst, it's it's just a great story, and no one will ever find the treasure because it may be difficult to find, and who knows, at best maybe someone does find it someday. But the fact that those Liberty bonds have never been cashed in, everyone uses that as pretty much proof that the treasure is still out there. So you can leave your thoughts in the comments. Thanks.